Shalom and welcome to Now Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. We're continuing in our series in the book of Genesis. This is teaching number 23, and we'll be focusing on Genesis chapter 16. I've titled this teaching, Who is the Angel of the Lord? So hopefully we'll find a good answer to that as we go through this teaching. I also wanted to begin with several other questions to prepare us for this chapter. Number one, to whom does the Lord speak in Genesis chapter 16? Number two, why did Sarai give Hagar to Avram as a wife? Number three, who are the physical and spiritual descendants of Hagar's son today? Number four, who is the angel of the Lord? Number five, what practical applications can we learn from this account in Genesis chapter 16? So we'll be thinking about those questions as we go through this teaching. And let's get right into the text with Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 to 6. Now Sarai, the wife of Avram, did not bear him any children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant, and her name was Hagar. Then Sarai said to Avram, Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from giving birth. Please go into my maidservant. Perhaps I will establish myself through her. Avram listened to Sarai's voice. Then Sarai, the wife of Avram, took Hagar the Egyptian, her maidservant, at the end of 10 years of Avram dwelling in the land of Canaan, and she gave her to Avram, her husband, as a wife to him. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. When she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarai said to Avram, My violence is because of you. I gave my maidservant into your bosom, and when she saw that she conceived, I became despised in her eyes. May the Lord judge between me and between you. Then Avram said to Sarai, Behold, your maidservant is in your hand. Do to her what is good in your eyes. Then Sarai afflicted her, and she fled from her presence. So that's verses 1 to 6. And we read in the beginning how Sarai did not have any children. And I asked the question, is this the first time we read of Sarai's barrenness, right? Her barren state, that state of not having any children. We first read that Sarai was barren when she and Avram lived in Ur of the Chaldees, as we read in Genesis 11:30, and Sarai was barren. She had no child. Now, we don't know exactly how old Sarai was at that time in Ur of the Chaldees. However, from the context, we can assume that a few years of marriage had already passed in order to conclude that she was barren, right? At least a year or two had to pass in order to start saying, where are the children? Now, this was, again, when Avram and Sarah were still in Ur of the Chaldees, and they were younger. And then they traveled together with Avram's father to Haran, as we've learned in the previous chapters. And then they left Haran in obedience to the voice of the Lord and entered into the land of Canaan. Now we know that Avram was 75 years old when he made the journey to the land of Canaan, and that Sarai was 10 years younger than him. Therefore, Sarai was 65 years old when they entered into the land of Canaan. Now Sarai was barren for some years in Ur of the Chaldees, and now 10 more years had passed since they entered the land of Canaan, making Sarai 75 years as we have the context of Genesis chapter 16. Now God had promised to bless the seed of Avram, but he had no children. Avram struggled to understand this promise of God about his seed, as we reviewed in Genesis chapter 15 in the previous chapter. Now God made a promise and a guarantee to Avram that he would have a child from his own body and that his seed would become like the stars in the sky. Now, up to this point in the narrative of Avram and Sarai, God had not stated anything about Sarai being the mother of Avram's children or child. However, since she was his wife, it could be assumed that she would be the bearer of that seed, right? Now, Sarai probably felt humiliated by this situation, and she expressed her frustration to Avram while offering a solution to this predicament. As we have read in verse 2, then Sarai said to Avram, Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from giving birth. Please go into my maidservant. Perhaps I will establish myself through her. And Avram listened to Sarai's voice. Now we read here how Sarai blamed the Lord for her inability to bear children. Was Sarai correct in saying that the Lord had prevented her from having children? This appears to be a rational and biblical explanation since it's ultimately God who opens and closes the womb, as we see throughout the scriptures. And I listed a couple of references there in Genesis chapter 20, in Genesis chapter 30, and there's many others in the scriptures, right? We consistently see how the Lord opens and closes the womb. There's the natural flow of life on earth, but then there's times when he opens and closes. Now, a couple of questions to consider. Number one, did Sarai seek the Lord regarding this issue, regarding her state of being barren? Was she praying and seeking the Lord? Number two, did Sarai ask the Lord if she should give Hagar, her maidservant, to Avram in order to have children through her? Now, the Bible is silent on this matter, but it is a good reminder to continually seek the Lord about all things in life. It can be difficult to know when to simply make a decision in order to resolve a problem and when to seek the Lord's counsel and wait on Him for a clear answer. All of us struggle in one way or another about how to discern what the Lord is saying and when to simply wait on the Lord and allow Him to provide an answer. Now, there's some things in life that are simple, other things are more complex. I want to share one example out of my own life of a situation where I had to rely on the Lord in a unique manner. And I want to share something from when I was a young man. When I was about 26 years old, I had finished university a couple years earlier. I was working a full-time job. I was also volunteering with a certain student university organization, a Christian organization, and I was leading a certain student organization at a university in New Jersey. And it was a great opportunity to encourage the believers on campus and to reach out to those who were not yet believing. Now, during this time, there was a Christian conference coming up for Christian college students in the whole state, and I was getting our students ready to go to this. And I remember this certain week well as we were preparing to go that weekend, and we had a certain group that was going, and during that week, I had a certain event that happened, or several events. And I just want to explain that I was working a full-time job and I actually had three vehicles at the time. I had a motorcycle, a car, and I also had a work van that I used for my business. And I felt like as a single guy, it was more than enough. And so I ended up giving the car away to a friend. And I still had my motorcycle in the van to do my work and get around. And after I gave the car away on, let's say that was that Sunday, a couple of days later, the engine in my van died, and the engine cracked, and the repair to replace the engine was more than the van was worth. So I ended up not getting it repaired at that time. But I still had my motorcycle that I could get around on. But a couple of days after that, the motorcycle stopped working. And so within that week, I'd given the car away. I lost my van, and then my motorcycle stopped working. So all three vehicles were no longer available to me. Now this was, I think it was like on a Thursday when I lost my last vehicle, the motorcycle, and I was a bit frustrated by it. And the next day I was leaving on this trip with these students, and we had a vehicle to use from a Christian community there that let us use it for the students, like a multi-passenger van. So that was taken care of. But as I got the students together and we went on Friday, actually before that, I had spoken to my family about the situation. They're like, just buy a new car and don't worry about it. And I was a newer believer, and I was trying to figure out what to do in that situation, right? Should I buy a car? Should I wait? And I was a bit conflicted about, how do I make a decision in this, or do I just need to, be proactive and just decide something? So half of it was wanting to be a good, follower of our Lord and to wait on Him. Other part was I didn't really have much time to think about it because it was like a Thursday when I lost my motorcycle or stopped working, and the next day I was leaving on this trip, so it wasn't much time to really make a decision. But it forced me to really rely on the Lord and to just trust Him for the outcome. So I went on this trip with the students. We went down to this conference center, and that evening, on Friday evening, I was gathered together with some other leaders, and we were just talking in a circle, and two of the students came up and they said, we're going to pray. Is there anything we can pray for any of you guys? And I share with them my story in brief, how I had three vehicles, now I had none. And they said, okay, we'll pray. And they left. And one of the guys that I was talking to said, do you need a vehicle? And I said, yeah. And he says, well, my wife and I have been praying and we want to give away a vehicle. So I think we should give it to you. And so in that short time, the Lord answered my prayer and provided a vehicle. He had this all planned out. And I just needed to wait on him. Now that was a unique opportunity of being able to see his provision, of providing that answer to that problem when I didn't know what would happen. And thankfully, he kind of took any opportunity for me to do anything else at that time. But it was beautiful to see how the Lord answers prayer when we seek Him. Now, I only waited 24 hours or maybe a few more hours, but we always need to seek the Lord. It's a good reminder, and we need to learn how to make wise decisions and also learn how to wait on the Lord and wait for His answer. Now, Avram and Sarah were in a little bit of a different situation, and we know that it had been a long time that they've been waiting to have children, even as we read in the text in verse 3, is that Avram was in the land for 10 years at the time when Sarai made this decision to give Hagar to her husband. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about this phrase at the end of 10 years, because the Hebrew of this phrase is miketz eser shanim. And it simply says at the end of 10 years. But this word miketz is often used in the scriptures to indicate the end of something, but also it's used to indicate the beginning of something new. And I just want to provide a few examples from the scriptures just to illustrate how it's used in this way. Now, we first see miketz in the story of Cain and Abel. In Genesis 4:3, where it says, and it happened at the end of days that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. And we remember that situation, and most likely in that context, the end of days there was referring to either the harvest time or the time of giving of the first fruits to the Lord. That's clearly in that context. And we know that Abel brought an offering that was pleasing to the Lord, but Cain's offering was not pleasing to the Lord. And the Lord talked with Cain and told him to overcome his sin and to do that which was right. But Cain decided to kill his brother instead, right? And so at the end of these days, we ended up having Cain kill Abel, and that was the first murder recorded in the scriptures. And there was that change of season from that innocence, in a sense, to having murder in the world. So there was an end of time, but it was also a beginning of a new era. Now, the second time we see miketz is in the situation with the flood in Genesis 8:6. Where it says, and it happened at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark, which he made. Right now, this is after the flood had ended, the waters were receding, and Noah was trying to determine if it was safe to release everyone from the ark. And so it was at the end of the time of the flood and the beginning of a new day, right? So again, we see how miketz is used in that kind of dual meaning. The third time we see miketz is here in Genesis 16, and then just to share one other example in Genesis 41, where we see the word miketz used, and this is the situation with Joseph and Pharaoh when Joseph was still in prison. And it says in Genesis 41:1, now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. Now, the context of this phrase at the end of 2 full years is when Joseph was in prison after being falsely accused. Not that he was in prison for 2 years, right? He was in prison for more than that. But the 2-year marker was from the time that he interpreted the dreams of the 2 officials of Pharaoh, and he asked to be remembered when the dreams were fulfilled, especially by the one who lived, right, the cupbearer. But he was forgotten. So Joseph remained in that prison. But after the period of 2 years, right, at the end of 2 full years, Pharaoh had dreams that disturbed him, and there was no one to interpret them. And that's when the cupbearer remembered Joseph, and he was taken out of prison and brought before Pharaoh. And it was the end of Joseph's confinement in prison and the beginning of his ruling in the land of Egypt, being second only to Pharaoh, right? So the miketz eser shanim there, or what's it called? Miketz, it's 2 full years. I forget what the Hebrew is exactly. That's okay. It was at the end of 2 full years that that Joseph was released from prison, right? And a new era of him ruling in the land of Egypt was begun. So we consistently in the scriptures see the significance of miketz as it speaks of the end of something and the beginning of something new. Now we see a similar use of miketz in Genesis 16 as Sarai wanted to end her state of barrenness by means of a new birth through her maidservant Hagar. So it's interesting as we see that word used in this context as well. Now, what sounded like a good idea in Sarai's head quickly became complicated, right? As we read in verse 3, Sarai, the wife of Avram, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maidservant, and she gave her to Avram, her husband, as a wife to him. And I've highlighted all of these different titles or labels for who is who and who belongs to whom, because it's a little bit complicated and dizzying to see all the relationships here. You have a wife giving, a maidservant to her husband as a wife, and it's a good reminder of God's original plan, right? God intended for man to have one wife, not two or more, and when you have more, it gets complicated. And it didn't take too long for this situation to get complicated, as we read in verse 4. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. When she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Sarai's maidservant conceived by Avram, and she immediately felt like the queen in the kingdom of Avram, right? And Sarai was belittled in the eyes of Hagar. So the very thing that Sarai hoped would bring her joy ended up bringing her great emotional pain. Now, it's helpful to remember the history of Hagar. How did Hagar become the maidservant of Sarai? Now, we don't actually have a biblical answer to this clearly. However, I think we can put together the pieces. Hagar most probably became a maidservant to Sarai and became part of Avram's extended family as a result of their earlier trip to Egypt. Avram had Sarai tell a half-truth that she was his sister, and Pharaoh took Sarai as his wife. Pharaoh also gave Avram flocks and cattle, together with male and female servants for Sarai. Now, it's assumed that Hagar was part of that dowry, right? She was part of the female servants that were given to Avram in exchange for his wife, in a sense. So it's kind of interesting how it plays out in the end. Now, we know that the Lord struck Pharaoh's house with a plague, and then Pharaoh returned Sarai to Avram and expelled them from his land. And then Hagar was given to Avram, and then Sarai became Hagar was given to Avram and then to Sarai because of that compromising situation in Egypt, right? So, in a sense, they shouldn't have had Hagar. They shouldn't have gone down there and gotten that whole situation, but they did, and now Hagar was with them. And then Hagar became Avram's wife because of Sarai's desire to redeem herself from being childless. So that's kind of the whole scenario that brings us up to where we're at now. And then we see Sarai's response to Avram after Hagar became pregnant, and is actually a difficult response, right? As we read in verse 5, then Sarai said to Avram, "My violence is because of you. I gave my maidservant into your bosom, and when she saw that she conceived, I became despised in her eyes. May the Lord judge between me and between you." So this is a harsh word that Sarai spoke to her husband, Avram. She was obviously frustrated and became quite angry, and she blamed Avram for her quote unquote violence as a result of her being despised in Hagar's eyes. I just want to explain the Hebrew here because it's easy to translate, but it's difficult to kind of understand how it's being used. We uniquely see the word violence here used to describe Sarai's anger or emotions. Now, the Hebrew phrase for "my violence is because of you" is simply "chamasi alecha." So my violence is upon you, or my violence is because of you. So it's pretty clear as far as the translation. But we see the word Hamas used here, which means violence. And if you remember when we were studying Genesis chapter 6, that's where we first see the word Hamas used in the scriptures. in Genesis 6, 11, and 13 to speak of the violent state of mankind in the days of Noah before the flood. And it says that that Hamas filled the earth, right? Hamas and wickedness, violence and wickedness filled the earth. And that's why God destroyed the earth. So this word Hamas to describe Sarai's reaction to her being despised in the eyes of her maidservant seems to fit the situation. It was an intense emotional feeling and possibly physical reaction, right? Now, Sarai went from the expectation of becoming a pseudo mother through her maidservant to wanting nothing to do with her maidservant or the child that would come from her. We then read in verse 6 how Avram responded to Sarai's violence, how Sarai acted toward Hagar, and finally, how Hagar responded to Sarai's violence. And it's all summed up in this one verse, in verse 6. Then Avram said to Sarai, "Behold, your maidservant is in your hand. Do to her what is good in your eyes." Then Sarai afflicted her, and she fled from her presence. So we can assume here that Sarai became violent, either emotionally or physically, with Hagar, and Hagar responded by fleeing from her. Now, the next verses and the remainder of the chapter focus on Hagar and the future of the child whom she would bear. So let's continue in verses 7 and 8, where we read, "Now the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, at the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, maidservant of Sarai, from where have you come and to where are you going?' And she said, 'I am fleeing from the presence of Sarai, my mistress.'" So it's verses 7 and 8. And we read here how the angel found Hagar by a spring on the way to Shur. So where is this location, Shur? As we see it in the middle of the map there in the screen, we have the wilderness of Shur, which is a desert area located in between Egypt and the southern region of Canaan. So it's basically just a big desert area. Now the angel asked Hagar, "From where have you come and to where are you going?" And Hagar said that she was fleeing from Sarai's presence, but she did not say where she was going. However, since the wilderness of Shur is on the way to Egypt from Hebron, right? Avram and Sarai were in Hebron in the area of the Oaks of Mamre. And so the wilderness of Shur is on the way to Egypt. So most likely she was fleeing back to where she came from, to Egypt. Now, who was this angel who met Hagar at the well? This angel is called Malach Adonai, right? The angel of the Lord. This is the first time we see the angel of the Lord in the scriptures. Now, although we read about angels many times in the scriptures, this title, Malach Adonai, or angel of the Lord, is considered to be a theophany, an appearance of God to humanity. Or more specifically, it could well be a pre-incarnate manifestation of the Messiah. And this is the Christian understanding of the angel of the Lord. And I specify that because Orthodox Judaism does not see it in this light. And just to also clarify that this is a Christian understanding based on what we see in the scriptures. And I think it's an accurate understanding, and I'll be explaining it more. But just to explain that Orthodox Judaism teaches that the angel of the Lord is only an angel, because in Judaism, there is no such thing as God taking the form of a man or appearing in this manner. In the teaching of Orthodox Judaism, God is only spirit and cannot take on human form. This is the reason that Orthodox Jews are opposed to the New Testament teaching of God becoming man through the Messiah, right? This is the very core of the belief of Jews and Gentiles who believe in Yeshua as the Messiah, right? That it's God become man. And Orthodox Judaism says this can never be, right? They teach against it. Now, again, I believe that this is clearly true, that God can come in the form of man, just as our Messiah did. And I just want to answer this question of what evidence do we see in the scriptures of the angel of the Lord being a theophany, right? An appearance of God in one way or another. I just want to look at a few different scriptures as we see Malach Adonai in the Old Testament. Now, this phrase appears 54 times in the Hebrew scriptures, the angel of the Lord, right? Malach Adonai. Now, that's not a lot of times. In fact, most of the time it appears in one chapter, like in one context, right? There's a couple different places in Judges where it appears like 10 times in one chapter and 10 in another. So there's not an overwhelming amount of times when we read about the angel of the Lord. So they're very specific times, and I want to review a few of them. The angel of the Lord generally distinguishes himself from a regular angel by talking in the first person as the Lord and being treated as God himself by the person, the human being who comes in contact with the angel of the Lord. Now, in Genesis 16, we see the angel of the Lord, or this phrase, Malach Adonai, right, 4 different times, just in this one chapter. Now, so Genesis 16 is the first time we see Malach Adonai. The next time we see Malach Adonai outside of Genesis 16 is in Genesis 22, when the Lord tested Abraham and asked him to sacrifice his son. And we read this in Genesis 22, verses 9 to 12. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So here in this context, we see how the angel of the Lord spoke in the first person, right, as the Lord himself. A few verses later in the same chapter, the angel of the Lord speaks again, verses 15 to 17. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. And again, the angel of the Lord is not just relaying a message from the Lord, but is speaking in the first person as the Lord. The next time we read about the angel of the Lord is in Exodus when the Lord spoke to Moses, and this is the burning bush incident, Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Exodus 3 tells us that the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in the fire in the midst of the bush, but it was the Lord himself who spoke to Moses. Now, there's many other examples, and I wanted to do them all, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to summarize a couple and end with one more example. In Numbers 22, we read how the angel of the Lord stood in the way to oppose Balaam, who was riding his donkey, right? The donkey saw the angel of the Lord and went down on the ground. The angel of the Lord appears several times in the book of Judges. The angel of the Lord appeared to the tribes of Israel, as we read about it in Judges 2. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon in Judges 6. In fact, that scenario is a wonderful just context of the angel of the Lord. He clearly is seen as God there. Gideon believes that he will die because he saw the angel of the Lord. So if you have a chance, you can take a look at Judges 6. And then there's another example where the angel of the Lord reveals himself to a couple who were barren, and he made a promise that they would have a child. And that's in Judges chapter 13. I want to read this account. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to read some of the main scriptures as we see the angel of the Lord as he came to inform Manoah and his wife that they would have a son. So let's begin in Judges 13, verses 1 to 3. Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, so that the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. There was a certain man of Zorah of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren, and had borne no children. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman, and said to her, Behold now, you are barren, and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and give birth to a son. So that's the introduction here to the angel of the Lord to Manoah and his wife, literally first to his wife. Now, the phrase the angel of the Lord is used 10 times in Judges 13, and one more time as the angel of God, right? But it's the same meaning here. Malak Adonai, this is Malak Elohim, but obviously it's speaking of the same angel here. It's just kind of a different wording. Now, after the angel of the Lord appeared for the second time to Manoah and his wife, Manoah asked if he could prepare a young goat for this one, whom he and his wife considered a man of God, like a prophet. And it's interesting to see the dialogue here. And I want to continue to read the final verses of Judges 13 to help piece together the identity of the angel of the Lord, because they struggle to understand his identity. And let's just read these verses here in Judges 13, 15 to 25. Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, Please let us detain you so that we may prepare a young goat for you. The angel of the Lord said to Manoah, Though you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you prepare a burnt offering, then offer it to the Lord. For Manoah did not know that he was the angel of the Lord. Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, What is your name? So that when your words come to pass, we may honor you. But the angel of the Lord said to him, Why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful? So Manoah took the young goat with the grain offering and offered it on the rock to the Lord. And he performed wonders while Manoah and his wife looked on. For it came about when the flame went up from the altar toward heaven that the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell on their faces to the ground. Now the angel of the Lord did not appear to Manoah or his wife again. Then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord. So Manoah said to his wife, We will surely die, for we have seen God. But his wife said to him, If the Lord had desired to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands, nor would he have shown us all these things, nor would he have let us hear things like this at this time. Then the woman gave birth to a son and named him Samson, and the child grew up, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahanadan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. So that brings us to the end of that chapter. The angel of the Lord answered Manoah's question regarding what is his name, right? He said, What is your name? And in verse 18, he said, Why do you ask about my name, considering it is wonderful? And the Hebrew for this word is pheli, which is the same root word pala, meaning wonderful or miraculous. And this is the same Hebrew word used in Isaiah 9:6, or in the Hebrew, Isaiah 9:5, for one of the names of the Messiah. We all know this verse, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace, right? And so that name, Wonderful Counselor, is Pele Yoetz. And again, we see that same root word, Pele, right? Meaning wonderful. Now, the angel of the Lord performed wonders, and I highlighted the other word for wonders there because that's the verb form, but you see the noun and verb form being used together here as the angel of the Lord performed wonders by ascending into the flame, which revealed to Manoah and his wife that the one who had been in their presence was God himself. Manoah understood that they would surely die because, as he said, they had seen God. Manoah's wife explained that God obviously would not kill them since he revealed the prophecy about their son Samson, who would be born to them. Now, I just want to conclude this question of who was the angel of the Lord by summarizing what we have seen in these passages. All of the examples that we have seen in the scriptures seem to consistently speak of the angel of the Lord as the Lord himself, uniquely as the Lord. The humans who interacted with the angel of the Lord understood that they were in the very presence of the Lord and feared that they would die as a result of being in the presence of God, of seeing God. Now, this fear of death, of after being in the presence of God or seeing God, is based on the scriptures. And we see an example of this in Exodus chapter 33, when Moses had asked to see the glory of the Lord. And we read this in Exodus 33, 18 to 20. Then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. And he said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show compassion on whom I will show compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live. And that is the general expectation, the kind of principle rule of the Lord, that you cannot be in God's presence. You cannot see God or see his face and live. Now, that being true, this is God's rule, and we see exceptions to this rule in the scriptures. In Exodus 24, we know that Moses, Aaron, his sons, and the 70 elders went up on the mountain of God, and they saw God. And it says, but he did not strike them to kill them. They should have been killed for being in God's presence and for seeing him, but not so. Judges 6, the same thing. Gideon thought that he would die because of seeing the angel of the Lord, but God said, you will not die, right? So there's expectation and there's the exception to the rule. Now, the angel of the Lord, as portrayed for us in the scriptures, consistently reveals a theophany, right? An appearance of God on earth in human form. Now, the angel of the Lord may be explained as a pre-incarnate revelation of the Messiah. And I think both these things are true. And, we cannot say it with absolute certainty, but it seems probable that it was Yeshua who revealed himself. Either way, God revealed himself, and Yeshua is God. Now, it is fitting that the first mention of the angel of the Lord appearing to a human being was to a foreign woman who was rejected by God's chosen couple on earth, Avram and Sarai. Avram did not openly reject Sarai, or he did not openly reject Hagar, but he permitted Sarai to treat her harshly, and Hagar fled from Sarai. Now, just like our Messiah first appeared to Mary at the tomb after his resurrection, so our Lord first appears to a woman as the angel of the Lord in Genesis 16. It's just interesting to see that connection. Our Lord often uses the simple people in this world and the people who are often cast aside. Women have often been seen as second to men, and especially a servant woman, right? Hagar. But the Lord showed himself to her first as the angel of the Lord. Now, returning to Genesis chapter 16, we read that the angel of the Lord spoke to Hagar in the wilderness of Shur. So let's continue in verses 9 to 12. And the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and humble yourself underneath her hand. And the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly increase your seed, and it will be uncountable because of its great number. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you have conceived, and you will give birth to a son, and you will call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. And he will become a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in defiance of all of his brothers. So that's verses 9 to 12. Now, the first thing that the angel of the Lord said to Hagar after his initial question was to return to Sarai and humble herself under her hand, right, under the authority of Sarai. The angel of the Lord then spoke of the seed of Hagar, right, in verse 10. And the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly increase your seed, and it will be uncountable because of its great number. Now, although Hagar's child would not be the one who would inherit the possessions and blessing of Avram, there was a partial blessing in the seed that she carried. Since Avram was the father of her child, an aspect of the blessing of the Lord would be upon her seed and on the generations that would come from him, from Ishmael. The descendants through Hagar's child would also become an uncountable people. However, the prophecy regarding this child was not positive. As we read in this prophecy, I just want to read verse 12. We know that the angel said that you should call him Ishmael in verse 11. And then in verse 12, he said, and he will become a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in defiance of all of his brothers. This is a harsh word. It's a difficult word. Now, Hagar was to name her son Ishmael, and he was to become a wild donkey of a man. Now, this phrase in Hebrew is porei Adam. The Hebrew word porei is used 10 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and it always means a wild ass or a wild donkey. There is no polite way to explain the meaning of this word used to describe Hagar's child as a wild donkey of a man. I believe this was a curse that continues on the peoples descended from Ishmael and those who identify with Ishmael today. Arab Muslims and everyone who identifies with Islam are aligning themselves with Ishmael. Muslims believe and teach that Ishmael was the blessed son of Abraham and that Islam is the only true religion. By aligning themselves with Ishmael, they align themselves with his curse of being a wild donkey of a man. Arab Muslim culture demonstrates well this characteristic that was assigned to Ishmael. Often we see Arab Muslims fight amongst themselves, even killing each other. And I think this is part of the curse of Ishmael that followed through, that came into Islam, and I'll explain that a little bit more. And just to mention too that it's not just Arabs, right? Because you also have other nationalities of people who identify with Islam, and they're basically identifying with the spiritual line of Ishmael. Now, according to Islamic history, Muhammad was born in Makkah or Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia today, and the people of Makkah claim Ishmael as their ancestor. And just to read this quote from an introduction to the Quran, and it says this: the Makkans, right, the people of Mecca, claimed descent from Abraham through Ishmael, and tradition stated that their temple, the Kaaba, had been built by Abraham for the worship of the one God, right? So that's their foundational belief of how they descended from Ishmael and how this worship of God was came down through Abraham, right, who built this holy place. Now, Islam seeks to conquer with the sword or the gun or whatever weapon they have and to establish a world under Islamic rule. There is no peace in Islam. Islamic jihad, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, teaches to kill the Christians and Jews unless they submit to the Muslims. The curse of Ishmael lives on through the religion and culture of Islam, which is predominantly adhered to by Arabs who see themselves as descendants of Ishmael. Now, I say Arab Muslims, right? Because there's Arab Christians, but they're obviously redeemed through their faith in the Messiah, through Yeshua. Now, the curse of Ishmael is only broken through the blessing of Abraham, through the promised seed of Isaac. The blessing that all families and nations of the world would be blessed through Abraham's seed is ultimately fulfilled in the Messiah. We've talked about this many times, even in the previous teaching, going back to Genesis 12:3, and as we see fulfilled in the New Testament in several scriptures, including Galatians 3:8-9. And we see this consistently in the scriptures. Belief in Yeshua as the Messiah is the only cure for the curse of Ishmael and for Islamic jihad. Now, a more complete description of Hagar's son, Ishmael, is found in the continuation of verse 12. So I just want to read verse 12 again in its entirety, where it says, and he will become a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in defiance of all of his brothers. Again, this is not an easy prophecy to read about a child. And just to say that this phrase, his hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, is fairly just straightforward translation of the text. And the final sentence there in that verse is, and he will live in defiance of all of his brothers. And in the Hebrew, that says, Ve'al panei kol echav yishkon. And a literal translation would be, and he will live against the face of all his brothers. Um, but in the context, you can see it as, living in defiance of or in the face of. And this sentence clearly indicates that Ishmael would live in opposition to the other sons of Abraham, especially to Isaac. Now we read actually a similar sentence in Genesis chapter 25 that also explains this kind of prophecy about Ishmael. And this is in context of listing the descendants of Ishmael. Ishmael had 12 sons. And we read about them in Genesis 25. I'm not getting into the details of Genesis 25. I just want to read this one verse, Genesis 25:18. At the end of the descendants of Ishmael, it says, they settled from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt, as one goes toward Assyria. He settled in defiance of all of his relatives. And again, it explains, I'm not going to get into the details, it explains kind of the area where these descendants of Ishmael live. This is basically all of that, Arabia region, even today. And it's interesting that these peoples mostly stayed in the same area. Now, that last phrase here where it says he settled in defiance of all his brothers, in Hebrew, that is, al panei kol echav Nafal. Now it's interesting because it's very similar to what we read in Genesis 16, in the face of all of his brothers, or in defiance of his it says relatives in his translation, but right, it's achiv, his brothers, relatives. But the word that's translated as settled there, as I highlighted in pink, it's actually in Hebrew, it's the word nafal, which simply means to fall. So literally, like, he fell in defiance of all his brothers. It's very interesting, the wording. It's not very positive as far as the prophecy over Ishmael, and it's just good to see how the scriptures detail this and to understand how it even affects reality today. Just like all of humanity, the sons of Ishmael need redemption, right? We all need redemption. And I think those who identify with Ishmael in this way need especially that redemption from that curse. And redemption is only in the Messiah, Yeshua. Now we come to the final verses of Genesis 16 and the reaction of Hagar to all that she experienced at that time, especially being in the presence of the angel of the Lord. So let's read the final verses of Genesis 16. And she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "Did I really see here the one who sees me?" Therefore the well was called the well of the living one who sees me. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. Then Hagar gave birth to a son for Avram. And Avram called his son's name, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Now Avram was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael for Avram. And that brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 16. Let's just focus on a few of the details here. I'll wrap this up. Now, verse 13 has a little bit of a challenge of a translation. The first part is fairly straightforward, where she said, Ata el ro'i, you are the God who sees me. It's very clear. But the second part of this verse is challenging. The Hebrew says, Hagam halom ra'iti acharei ro'i. And I think it's translated best as, did I really see here the one who sees me? So it seems that Hagar was asking a question to herself at a time of astonishment of what just transpired right before her eyes. The angel of the Lord came and spoke to her at the well. And after questioning her, the angel of the Lord told her that she needed to return and humble herself under the hand of Sarai, her mistress. The angel of the Lord also prophesied regarding the son whom she would bear. He told her that she was to name him Ishmael, and he described the kind of person that he would become, a wild donkey of a man. He also spoke of the uncountable nature of the seed that she carried, and he would become a great multitude. Now, verse 13 records Hagar's response to all this, especially to coming in the presence of the angel of the Lord. And it says, and she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "Did I really see here the one who sees me. And the text of the scriptures again support and testify that the angel of the Lord who came to her was the Lord himself, who revealed himself to her in whatever fashion or form he was revealed to her, right? We don't know how the angel of the Lord presented himself to Hagar, but in some way she saw him, she heard him, and they had that conversation. Now, verse 14 tells us that the well was called the well of the living one who sees me. And again, it is a testimony that the angel of the Lord was a theophany, right? An appearance of God himself. And finally, in the last two verses, we have the end of the story of Genesis 16, where we read, Then Hagar gave birth to a son for Avram, and Avram called his son's name, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Now, Avram was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael for Avram. So the text tells us that Hagar gave birth and that Avram named him Ishmael, right? The name that the angel of the Lord told her she should name him. And we do not read that Hagar returned to Sarai, but obviously she did, right? So there's some things in the scriptures that we can simply say that, okay, he told her that, and we don't read it, but obviously she went back to Avram and Sarai, submitted herself. She gave birth in the presence of Avram and Sarai, and that child was considered Avram's son at that time. Now, just to conclude this teaching, in the beginning, I asked a series of questions, and the first question was, to whom does the Lord speak in Genesis chapter 16? And I think the answer is clear. The Lord only spoke to Hagar, the Egyptian maidservant of Sarai. We never read in this chapter that Avram or Sarai sought the Lord, prayed to the Lord, or that the Lord spoke to them at that time. Now, maybe they did pray, maybe he did speak to them, but we don't read about that in this chapter. With all of the activity in Genesis chapter 16, the Lord only spoke to Hagar, the Egyptian maidservant. We read three names that were ascribed to different ones in the final four verses of this chapter. Number one, Hagar called the Lord, You are the God who sees me. Number two, the well of the spring was named, quote, the well of the living one who sees me. And number three, the son of Hagar in Avram was named Ishmael, meaning God hears. And it's beautiful to read these names because they all testify to who God is, to how he sees us, to how he hears the human voice, and how he cares for each living soul. A whole chapter of the Bible is dedicated to an Egyptian maidservant of Avram and Sarai. Despite the drama from beginning to end, we read a unique intervention of the Lord himself as the angel of the Lord, who both hears and sees the situation of Hagar. It is a beautiful reminder that no matter what the situation in life, that the Lord sees individuals and hears the heart's cry. God sees, God hears, and God intervenes in the affairs of humanity to bring about his ultimate plans. And it's just a good reminder that God is trustworthy, even in the most difficult situations. And we just end with that name that Hagar gave to the angel of the Lord, El Roi, right? The God who sees me. It's just a beautiful expression of how God sees the most simplest person on earth, right? The Egyptian maidservant to Avram and Sarai. And beautiful to see how God spoke into that situation. He hears, he sees, and he acts according to the need at the time. So this is the conclusion to this teaching on Genesis chapter 16. Who is the angel of the Lord? Here's some of the resources I used in my preparation. As always, feel free to share this teaching with others. I also want to invite you to partner with us. Nyala Reglai is a non-profit organization, and we're totally dependent on donations from viewers like yourself. You can give a donation on our website, nyalareglai.com, or you can simply scan the QR code on the screen. It will take you to the website. I also want to invite you to subscribe to our weekly emails if you're not already receiving them. Again, you can do this on the website, nyalareglai.com, and you can either click the give or subscribe tabs as needed. Thank you so much. God bless you, and see you again next time.